good morning, everybody. I'm saying good morning because at the moment it's 8 o'clock on Friday morning in Australia. So I know that it's still Thursday for you, but I'm not quite sure what that means, but it probably means that I'm fresh. So what I wanted to talk about today are a number of topics, primarily around stakeholder engagement and what you can do to improve the effectiveness of stakeholder engagement. So I wanted to talk about what a stakeholder is and who can be a stakeholder. Thinking about each one of us being unique also means that our stakeholders are unique. And so in some cases, it's okay to send the regular reports, but in some cases, you need to start thinking about how you might craft special information packages for important stakeholders or for times in your work where you need to have more stakeholder support than you're currently achieving. This leads me to talking about communication and how to engage stakeholders and how to measure success, and also how to minimise miscommunication, which is obviously one of the things that is common in all areas of work, whether it's projects or other sorts of organisational activities. And what I'm going to do is talk about some extractive industries, some mining industries, and the issues that we've addressed there, which very, very nicely and very neatly also help people working in organisations or other parts of the corporate world to improve how they think about their communication as well. And I also want to then finally briefly talk about the stakeholder circle methodology and how it can be used successfully. Okay. So you may recall Through a Looking Glass, Lewis Carroll's story about Alice in Wonderland and beyond. So in Through a Looking Glass, Humpty Dumpty and Alice are having a conversation, and it goes something like this. "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, until I tell you. I mean, there's a nice knockdown argument for you. But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument." Humpty replied in a scornful tone, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." And Alice's concern was appropriate. How can communication be effective if words can mean whatever the speaker wants them to mean? If the message is confusing and open to misunderstandings and misinterpretation because of the wrong choice of words, wrong emphasis, or improper delivery, how can it be effective? How can it be effective? And so part of the underlying theme of this presentation today is the concept of communication competence. Research found that communication competence determines the success of a project or organisational activity and is developed through the following factors, and these are the ones we're going to focus on today. Understanding the stakeholder community and developing a robust relationship between the team in the organisation and the stakeholders. And then effective information sharing, making sure the right information goes at the right time for people to do their jobs, share opinions, discuss ideas, learn from each other, or just be successful in what they do. So today I'm going to address these topics by discussing the what, who, how of stakeholders. Stakeholders. And I like PMI's definition. I think it's one of the best ones around. PMI have said that stakeholders are individuals, groups or organisations who may affect or be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision, activity or outcome of a project, program or portfolio. So you can see by this definition, it's a very wide definition. Some of the reasons why organisations get into trouble when doing stakeholder engagement is that they neglect large groups of people because they believe they don't have time to focus on all of the stakeholders that they should and just choose the ones who yell the loudest or the ones who are senior managers or the ones that appear to have the most power. But any stakeholder, no matter how powerful or not, if they believe that their expectations or needs are being ignored, are going to be not supportive, and they may be the very ones that cause you problems. And I'm going to talk about an example of that in a moment. Now, the thing about stakeholders is that not only in English, in the English-speaking world, do we have difficulty defining what a stakeholder can be. The meaning of stakeholders varies. And so as I've worked in different countries, this is a question I've asked. How do you define stakeholders? And it's not necessarily just Google translation of the English word. Often cultural ideas are embedded in that as well. So, for example, the Spanish think of stakeholders as interested parties. They don't necessarily always think of stakeholders as being one person. They generally focus more on groups, as do the French. But the German translation of stakeholders is more about those who are involved, or the person who is involved, or the person who has a claim. As you can see, is just people or a person having a stake, whatever that is. Whereas the Japanese and Chinese, who have different views of relationships, focus more on the relationships. So in Japan, it's people sharing the risks and profits. And in China, it's about participants with related interest. And so all these different definitions of stakeholders can also be confusing if you're working in a multinational environment or dealing with stakeholders who are in a totally different country and come from a different culture than you. And we're going to talk about some of those differences later in this presentation. So who can be stakeholders? It's not just shareholders. And a lot of the major corporations in recent years have caused ethical considerations and major financial meltdowns by just focusing on shareholder value and the price of shares. There's also recognition that customers are stakeholders, and of course senior managers are as well, and suppliers, and often employees, but not so often as we'd like. But there are also other sorts of stakeholders as well, individuals and groups, things such as residents who will be affected by new buildings or railroad extensions or road extensions, or even the environment can be considered affected by work that's being done. But one important thing to point out is that every stakeholder has a stake. And in my early days of teaching this, somebody pointed out to me, if I reorganise the different types of stake, I'll have something to remind us of what all of the stakes can be in the form of ironic. But thinking in terms of what those stakes can be, they are these. So interest, a stakeholder will have an interest. And that's a circumstance in which that stakeholder is affected by an action or a decision. So, for example, I live in Melbourne and I live near Albert Park, where the Australian Grand Prix is run every year. And in fact, they're setting up the park right now. And that means that I don't have access to my walks around the lake. It means that the swans disappear for a couple of weeks. And it means that we have a lot of noise over the time the Grand Prix is being run. I don't care for road races. I don't care for that sort of sport. But nevertheless, I have an interest. I'm a stakeholder with an interest in the Grand Prix because I will be affected by the running of the Grand Prix. The second stake a stakeholder can have is rights. So they can be either legal or moral. So legal rights are things that have been brought about by legislation, such as privacy or occupational health. But moral rights also are equally important, and they can refer to environmental or social issues, for example. So they may extend to speaking on behalf of those who can't speak for themselves, whether they're people or environments or even